It's Alexandra from the Middle-Sized Garden YouTube channel and blog in southeast England, where we roughly equate to a USDA hardiness zone of 9 in the winter, although it has to be said we're a bit closer to a 5 in the summer because we have mild winters and quite cool summers. But I grow a lot of the same plants as Linda does. And I talk about things like garden design on the blog, and also visits to gardens and interviews with head gardeners and trips around my own garden. And one of the things that Linda and I agreed on when we were talking about doing front gardens together was that the architecture of your house has such an impact on the design of your front garden. It doesn't need to be a straitjacket, but it is an incredibly good starting point. This house was built in 1781, so it's Georgian, which equates to the colonial era in the United States and around the world. And the principles of the design were symmetry and simplicity. It was based on classical Greek and Roman architecture. A local historian told us that the house was very suitable for a modest gentleman of the time, compared to, for example, what even a very modest gentleman would have enjoyed in Victorian era, which would be about 50 to 100 years later, where they would have had elaborate plaster ceilings and great big fireplaces and patterned floors. The detail in this house is quite simple, and the floors are simple, the doors are simple, and the fireplaces are really quite simple. So simplicity and symmetry had to be the watchwords behind the front garden. It was basically designed by our predecessors over 30 years ago, but it's worked so well that we haven't changed it much. Firstly, starting with plants. I don't think we'd expect to have the same plants that we had in 1781 because we've got a much wider choice now. But the principles of simplicity mean that there are only really 6 types of plants in this garden. There's a very simple colour scheme. Apart from the green of foliage, there's also pink flowers or white flowers. There are pink roses running on either side of the main path and along the fence. And there are pink nerines which bloom in autumn that run along the front of the house. We've added 2 crabapple trees, Malus hupahensis, on either side of the gate, and their blossom is white. But when it comes to architectural detail, I think it is really worth looking at the techniques and at the materials that were used at the time. The railings in the front of this house were taken away in the Second World War, theoretically to make munitions or planes for the war effort. But when we came, we actually researched what they would have looked like in Georgian times, from old photographs, local memories of what they'd been like before the war, and also by the marks that were left in the stone. And there was one upright that had been left buried in the stone, and the person who made our railings was able to scrape down and find out exactly what the colour would have been in Georgian times, which is why we've got this blue-green, which we had actually matched up to it. Having these railings craftsman made in exactly the same materials and to the same design as they were in Georgian times was actually twice as expensive as using Georgian style railings, which would have been cheaper, but I am very glad that we did it. And then there's the 2 patches of lawn on either side of the path. In Georgian times, these would not have been the same kind of lawns as we have today. The lawn grasses we have today were only just being developed, and there was certainly no lawnmowers until 1830. Lawns have always been a status symbol because they're a sign that you've got land that doesn't have to be used for growing food, and also that you can afford, in the days before lawnmowers, you could afford the staff to have them scythed. So I think these probably would have looked quite lawn-like. And we are doing an experiment, and we're going to go back to meadow. Now, I think probably the Georgian modest gentleman would always have cut his lawn more often, and we're only proposing to cut it once a year so that the meadow flowers can bloom. So I'm not sure what this experiment is going to turn out like, but I'd like to try it, and I'll keep you updated with the monthly tours and tips on the Middle-Sized Garden. And now, back to Linda for more of her very good front garden advice.
Well, Alexandra, I'm so glad that this is the topic that you wanted me to share with you. Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Vater. I live in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, here in the States. And if you're an international follower, that's just north of Texas in the South Heartland of the United States. And I'm so especially pleased about this because it accentuates 2 topics that I am just really passionate about. And one is something I call my theory of garden relativism. relativity. And that is that everything in the garden relates to every other thing in the garden, and first and foremost, the architecture and style of your home. Secondly, it's another concept I call good garden fit, and that's that the style of gardening that you do should fit into the climate that you live in, the geography where you garden, the style of your home, the neighborhood, and even a good fit with your own resources in terms of labor, water, all of those different kinds of things. There should be good garden fit. So let me talk a little bit about my own house, which for Oklahoma is considered an older home. It was built in 1932 during a period when the Tudor style was very popular, which ran about from 1890 to 1940, unlike your home, which was built in the late 1700s. Nevertheless, we're a frontier state, and that's considered old here. So it was built in the 1900s. I live in an urban neighborhood near downtown Oklahoma City, and all of the homes in my neighborhood are of this same vintage. They were built in the 30s and the 40s, and they're all of a different style. Some are colonial revival, some like mine are Tudor. There's all sorts of different types of architecture represented in this neighborhood. All of our houses are relatively close together, so if you hear blowers or lawnmowers or kids playing, it's because, again, I want to accentuate the fact that put things in context. This is an urban neighborhood. Now, the architecture of my home is called Tudor style, and that's characterized by a number of different features. The very, very highly pitched roof with the deep gable, a massive fireplace, and you can see that there's also some chimneys on top that are sometimes narrow and really accentuate the detailing work at the top of the chimney. I also have lots of ovals and arches, which I will describe in a minute, has really informed the contours and the bed lines of my garden. It's not uncommon for Tudor style homes to be partially half timber. Mine is not like that. It's entirely a brick and stone facade, but it lends itself to a very, very English look. And there is my first tip. Match the style of your garden to the style of your home. So I have an English Tudor style home, so I have a very English garden. Now, this garden is about 30 years old, and when we moved in, there was nothing here. And when I say nothing, I guess I should make an exception. There was one very old, about 100-year-old oak tree that is the anchor of my entire landscape. But other than that, there was nothing except hard pan clay and maybe some little tufts of weeds. It was just really, really barren. So over time, I learned about garden design. I'm a self-taught garden designer, self-taught gardener, and I just kind of learned as I went. And one thing I learned was a really wonderful driving garden design principle, and that's that you can accentuate and mimic the lines of your home in the design of the bed lines. So since I have these wonderful arches over my doorway and on my side porch, I just mimicked pretty much the radius of those in my bed line, and you can see it here. And that's very, very easy to do. Sometimes, and here's a tip for viewers, I will stand upstairs and look out my upstairs windows down onto the landscape to see if the curves really do mimic the curves of my home. You'll also notice something else that I've done. Along the curb of my street, and also as an edging to my bed lines, I've used the same hardscaping material along those bed lines and along the edging as I did in my home. That way there's consonance, there's harmony, and there's continuity between the home and my garden beds. So in my garden beds, I have an edging of brick and stone. That perfectly matches the brick and stone on my house. I think otherwise it can be very discordant, and it doesn't look as if the entirety of the garden really speaks the same language, and that's very important to me. I really want my garden to speak the same language as my home. I think if I had something extremely contemporary with really strong edged linear clean lines, that it would be very much a departure from what the house itself is telling me. Now in my neighborhood and on social media, on YouTube and Instagram, I am known as the fairy tale house. There are some littles that walk by my house frequently, and they always tell their mamas, I want to walk by the fairy tale house. And I think that is largely because of the architecture of my home. It's interesting to me that some people describe my home as an English cottage, and other people describe it as kind of a manor house, depending on how they interpret the size and the scale of it. Now, speaking of scale, it's really important that the scale of the beds matches the scale of the house itself. I so often in these type of vintage homes, particularly here in the States in the 70s, you would see landscaping that was very much crammed against the front of the home, and then there would be nothing but a large expanse of lawn in the foreground. Well, I really wanted to avoid that, and so my beds actually come out, and on a very shallow grade, it flows down from my front porch, which is surrounded by a curving brick wall, all the way down to the curb. And again, I have tried to really emphasize that fairy tale quality. So I use lots of self-seeding plants. You can see there's a bumblebee right there that's hovering around the foxglove. I have lots of larkspur, columbine, chamomile, Minoan lace, all sorts of different type of flowers that will come in here and self-seed, taking the place of all of the tulips that I have in the spring. In the spring, there are probably close to 1,000 tulips here. There's blooming, creeping phlox. There's violas. There's pansies. It's just a cacophony of spring color here. Now, I garden in zone 7B, and in my Oklahoma state, we are characterized by very extreme weather events. So it gets very, very hot in the summers. It can get very, very cold in the winter, with lots of pretty exaggerated weather events in the meantime. This past winter, we had an epic ice storm. We set record-setting low temperatures, and we had, in a matter of 4 days, I believe, we had a 100-degree temperature shift. So obviously that presents all sorts of challenges that informs how I garden. And I would say the most important aspect, in addition to good garden fit and fitting my garden colors, my garden plantings and everything with the architecture of my home, is that it informs my seasonal plantings as well. Since it does get so hot here, I tend to have most of my color in the spring and in the fall. Not a whole lot in the summertime, where it just can get really, really brutally hot, and I would be out here basically just watering constantly, if not trying to hold up a huge shade canopy over the entirety of the yard. So that's an example of what I call basically really good garden fit. But I think that our homes tell a story. There's some of the activity that you can hear. in the background going by. But I think all of our homes, whether it's a Georgian home or a colonial revival or a Federalist style home, it really informs and tells a certain story. And I think that as you're trying to match the architecture of your own home to your garden, that's something that you might want to keep in mind. Does it tell a story, and does your garden tell a similar story to what your home tells you? As I said, mine was built in the 1930s. We moved in around 1990, and I have often wondered what kind of stories my house has to tell, as it was built just prior to World War II, and I can't imagine what kind of things went on in that period of time. So there is a little bit of history of my home, of the architecture of my home, how it informs the contours and the layout of my garden. And I'll try to put some stills in here of some different types of plantings that I use. It tends to be a combination of strong structural forms of evergreens, primarily boxwood and some hollies, juxtaposed against loose, billowy forms of self-cedars, of drift roses, daisies. I don't use a lot of annuals, but I do use some. And I guess it would really be negligent of me if I didn't also describe a little bit about one of the primary features, and I think one of the most interesting features of my home, and that's that I have a massive window box that's underneath the divided narrow windows on the front of my home, which is another characteristic of Tudor style homes. It's a massive window box. I have one on the front of my house, I have one on the back of my house, and I consider them to be mini gardens that are just filled to the brim with all sorts of seasonal plantings that obviously I change out as the seasons change. So there's a little tour of my garden. I wish you could sit here on one of my English garden benches that also matches the style of my home. We could have some tea, maybe some crumpets, and Alexandra, you would be my first guest.